Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for the Yeats International Summer School. This is the 62nd Summer School and the first one that's been online. We're delighted this evening to be joined by Dr. Joseph Hassett, but before we do so, I'd like to ask Cathaoirleach Dara Mulvey, who's the Chair of Sligo County Council, to say a few words. Cathaoirleach.
Thank you, Susan. As Chairman of Sligo County Council, we are delighted to be associated again, and this year on the 62nd year of the Sligo Yeats Summer School. I would like to welcome Dr. Joe Hassett and congratulate the committee on all their hard work over the years and wish you all the very best of good luck again this year with the Yeats Summer School.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I would like to express my thanks on behalf of the Board of Yeats Society Sligo for the continued support we receive from Sligo County Council, both for the work we do here at Yeats Society Sligo and specifically for their assistance in running the International Summer School. The title of the opening address for this 62nd Yeats International Summer School is Yeats Now, Poems for Today. It will be delivered by Dr. Joseph Hassett, who is a lifelong lover of Yeats. Joe Hassett is a man of many parts. A Harvard Law graduate, he worked as a lawyer for most of his professional life. But it was his deep and enduring passion for Anglo-Irish literature that first led him to come to Sligo for the fourth summer school back in 1963. And we are honoured that he is with us again to deliver the opening address for the 62nd Yeats Summer School. And in the between time, since 1963, Joe has come again and again back to Sligo, back to the fount of inspiration that inspired Yeats all his life. And Joe's knowledge and deep love of Yeats poetry is what you will find in his opening address. It's such a lovely idea to just dwell on the poems, but the poems in the context of what's happening today. Remember, W.B. Yeats was born in 1865. That's the 19th century, this the 21st century. Yeats continues to be a global poet. We've heard President Joe Biden just last week facing enormous challenges as he landed in the UK for the G7 summit. And he chose to quote Yeats, understanding always that the poet's capacity to just distill complex thoughts into short sentences, short thoughts, helps people to grasp what he is trying to say. Joe is also our very dear friend. He's a friend to the arts in Ireland, and he's especially a dear friend to the Yeats Society. As I say, we are honoured, but above all, we're delighted to welcome him and to thank him for delivering this address this evening and to officially open the Yeats International Summer School 2021.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that generous introduction. And hello to you and to all the faculty and students and friends of the Yeats Summer School, and to all the wonderful friends I have in Sligo, members of the Yeats Society and other friends in the Sligo community generally. The 58th summer has come upon me since I first attended the Yeats Summer School. It was the fourth summer school in 1963. It's a great honor and pleasure to return to this 62nd edition of the Yeats Summer School. It's the first, if I could steal Yeats's term that he and Maud Gunn used for their telepathic meetings when they were in different parts of the world. It's the first to take place on the astral plane. That, in their understanding, was a realm somewhere between the material world and the spiritual world. And if we grant ourselves the use of that term and that concept, we could think of our virtual summer school as hovering somewhere above a place that Yeats loved deeply, Sligo. And if we get that far, if you're with me, if you're with me this far, we could imagine Yeats being amongst us at this school. Certainly, we know that he insisted that the dead return to places to which they were passionately attached during their lifetime, where he said they come to our elbow amid their old, undisturbed habitations and tread the corridor and take the empty chair. Now, we don't have to swallow these ideas in their entirety to agree that we, all of us who are lovers of Yeats and who are participating in this school, are bound together in a common web of shared interest. And we can then accept the assertion in W.H. Auden's elegy that upon Yeats's death, he became his admirers. And in that sense, he is here because we are here. And as we launch into this 62nd school, another more practical question presents itself to us. Why are we still doing this in our 62nd year? Why has Yeats survived this long? Why do we still find it important to have this school? Well, there are a lot of answers to that question. The best one, in my mind, is one given by Seamus Heaney when he observed the necessity of Yeats. He explained it this way. He said, Yeats's poetry does what the necessary poetry always does, which is to touch the base of our sympathetic nature while taking in at the same time the unsympathetic reality of the world to which that nature is constantly exposed. The necessity of Yeats has been acutely brought home to many of us, I think, during these twin pandemics of COVID-19 and the even worse virus of racially and politically and religiously motivated hatred. Yeats's poems never flinch from the unsympathetic reality of a friend's illness, as many of us have experienced, or of the effects of hearts grown brutal. His poems become necessary because, having faced that unsympathetic reality, they respond by touching the base of our sympathetic nature. Many of us have recently, in the last year plus, experienced a friend's illness. Yeats bequeathed us a poem with exactly that title. He described the origin of the poem in his journal in a very moving passage, which ends with what I consider a line of poetry of an unversed sort, of which there is much in the world. When his friend Lady Gregory was ill in February 1909, he wrote this in his journal. More than kin was at stake. Gregory, he said, has been to me mother, friend, sister, and brother. I cannot realize the world without her. She brought to my wavering thoughts steadfast nobility. All day, the thought of losing her is like a conflagration in the rafters. Friendship is all the house I have. That last line is, I think, pure poetry, and it's one that I think is a great thought that has comforted many of us during the pandemic. Friendship is all the house we have. As I say that, I think again of the many wonderful friends I have in Sligo and have had in the Yeats community of scholars who come to the Yeats School over these 58 years since I first was in the beauty of Sligo and had the pleasure of meeting its wonderful people. Now, Yeats expressed a thought similar to that friendship is all the house I have in a little poem which he called a scrap of verse when he sent it to his friend Lady Gregory. And the poem, as promised, has the title A Friend's Illness. Here it is. Sickness brought me this thought. In that scale of his, why should I be dismayed, though flame had burned the whole world as it were a coal? now that I have seen it weighed against a soul. The poem, which arises out of that journal entry, carries the powerful notion that a friend and friendship can outbalance terrible onslaughts upon us from the outer world. Yeats famously celebrated the notion of friendship in his poem, The Municipal Gallery Revisited. And many of you know that poem, and it's an often quoted poem, but maybe the reason it's often quoted is that it's pretty worth quoting. A lot of you know the dramatic opening of the poem. Yeats, the speaker in the poem, is standing in the municipal gallery and looking up and sees portraits of his fellow workers in the creation of the imagination of modern Ireland. And so he starts out with, around me, the images of 50, around me, that's me with 58 years, around me, the images of 30 years. And he looks up at all those portraits, and he concludes by saying that, leading up to the memorable couplet that concludes the poem, he leads up to that by saying, the interesting thought, if you want to judge me, don't choose one isolated part of my life, but judge me on the basis of the friends that I had. So he says that better than I do, and I'll read it. You that would judge me, do not judge alone this book or that. Come to this hallowed place where my friends' portraits hang, and look thereon. Ireland's history in their lineaments trace. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was I had such friends. These last two lines are a great example of Yeats's genius for distilling the emotions that hover over life situations into something that crystallizes our own thinking and helps us articulate and express our thoughts. And we may do that, I think in this case, by adopting Yeats's position, but we might also do it by challenging Yeats's position. The main thing about the Yeats lines is that they are so crystalline and so memorable that they help us discover our own thinking. And then we can either go along with Yeats if our thinking does, or we can challenge him if they don't. And the line, I think, is an important entry point into Yeats. And we know that he himself told us in the beautiful poem, Adam's Curse, that he made his poems line by line. He talked about the stitching and unstitching of a line. The line may take us, a line will take us hours maybe, and yet our stitching and unstitching has been not. And yet, if they do not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been not. So the stitching and unstitching takes place at the level of the line, and I think we see that time and again in Yeats's poetry. And I think that those lines are a useful one way of summarizing our own thinking, and two, they are an entry point into the poem as a whole, and then into Yeats's work as a whole. Because I think when we look at a line by line memorable distillation by Yeats, we realize that we don't need to read a tremendous amount of esoteric philosophy or mythology to realize that we're dealing with an extraordinary human voice, and it's calling us to enter the poetry and be enriched by it. Now, Yeats also had a great facility for distilling thoughts and sentiments about large public issues, historical developments. And of course, one of the great poems in that vein is The Second Coming. Its lines are quoted almost nonstop these days, and they have been for many years. So we think of things fall apart, the center cannot hold. that's one that is, as I say, probably a 24/7 repetition. And the same, in a way, is true of the couplet with which the poem ends, one of those tantalizing Yeats questions, "And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born." These concluding lines are a key, in a way, to explaining the chaos in the poem in terms of Yeats's theory of history, in which historical events do not advance in a straight line of progress, as the Victorians thought, but unfold in recurring cycles. And so there's a rough beast about to be born. The poem was written in 1919, and in Yeats's cyclic theory, he saw an influx of violent energy into the universe from the incident in Greek mythology where Zeus rapes Leda. And he saw a peaceful influx at the birth of Christ, which he placed 2,000 years later. And writing, as I say, in 1919, his poem, anyway, looks toward a new violent influx in the year 2000. Joan Didion famously chose, she is a good example of somebody who found in a line of Yeats' poems a key to her own thinking about an important public event, which was also an important private event in her own psyche. And she chose the words "slouching toward Bethlehem" as the title of her famous 1967 essay about the lives of the disaffected young people in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. Didion's preface to the book that contained that essay describes a sentiment that I think hovers over many of us as we try to get our bearings, as we're still struggling to get through the COVID-19, and then looking beyond the hopeful day when we do get through it, what will our lives be like afterward? Very different, I think, more filled with uncertainty than they were before COVID-19 struck us quite out of the blue in the thinking of most of us. So here's what Didion said about that uncertainty and the chaos and her need for order in her preface. "I went to San Francisco," she said, "because I had not been able to work in some months, had been paralyzed by the conviction that writing was an irrelevant act, that the world as I had understood it no longer existed. If I was to work again at all, it would be necessary for me to come to terms with disorder." Now, just as those lines did for Didion, I think they help us, or can help us, to come to some terms with disorder by providing that framework of cyclic history within which we could at least make some sense out of the chaos and uncertainty that surrounds us. And I think in that regard of a line by the great T.R. Henn, who was the head of the summer school back in 1963 when I first attended it. And he made the interesting point, and this Second Coming is a great example of what he called in his famous book, The Lonely Tower, that Yeats had, he said, a curious clarity of vision, which is not a clarity of detail, but rather of imaginative focus, a sense of the processional element in life and in history. And I think Henn, who was a marvelous presence in Sligo and at the school and throughout Yeats studies and throughout the thinking world, he was a giant of a figure, wonderful man. It's an interesting thought that a poem like The Second Coming does provide some way of thinking about the processional element in history. And again, one could agree with it or disagree with it, but it provides a context. And importantly, I think it provides it in a very memorable form that makes it easy for us to carry it around in our heads and make use of it. It's quite interesting to me that the Second Coming was written during what I think is probably the last global pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. Ambassador Dan Mulhall discussed this in a brilliant talk he gave in Sligo, at least virtually in Sligo. He was in Sligo on the astral plane, or he was on the astral plane above Sligo, but he gave a very interesting talk. And we had discussed before his interesting thought that the Second Coming was written not only during the Spanish flu pandemic, but during a period when that pandemic had a very daunting influence on Yeats's own life. Both his wife and his father became seriously ill with pneumonia growing out of that Spanish flu pandemic. Now, there are a lot of historical context events around the writing of that poem, but I think that it's hard not to conclude that the huge emotional impact of the effect of that pandemic on Yeats's wife and father was not somewhere in his consciousness when he wrote that poem. And it's interesting too, again, without being mystified by numbers, it is interesting that the Spanish flu pandemic preceded COVID-19 by exactly 100 years. Now, although the Second Coming in a way coincides with that cycle, my own sense is that the poem is fundamentally a warning about the tendency of violence and hatred to recur. And thinking about that theme in the context of the COVID pandemic brings to mind Camus' famous novel, The Plague. The writer and translator Laura Maris made a very interesting comment on Camus' great novel that I think is an instructive analogy to how we might read and think about the Second Coming in its current incarnation. In her essay, which I think is a preface to her upcoming translation, she characterized the titular plague as, she said, a metaphor for war, the creep of fascism, the horror of Vichy France collaborating in mass murder. And she suggests that Camus intended his novel to be a kind of serum for the future. And I quote her some more, because he knew that his book would be needed again long after his death in a context he couldn't predict or imagine. She grounds her view in the novel's closing admonition that the plague's originating germ of hatred, and now I'm quoting from her translation of Camus, that originating germ of hatred, quote, never dies or disappears, that it could lie dormant for decades in furniture and linens, that it waits patiently in rooms, in basements, in trunks, among handkerchiefs and paperwork, end of quote, until one day it returns. And in the same way, I think the Second Coming reflects Yeats's theory that the trauma out of which his poem arose would return in ways it was impossible to predict or imagine. Interestingly, Derek Mann, one of Yeats's great poetic successors, really, is a great Irish poet who sadly passed away last year, saw and wrote a beautiful poem about the pertinence of the plague in an Irish context. In his poem, Camus in Ulster, he wrote, deprived though we were of his climatic privileges, and raised in a northern land of rain and murk, we too knew the familiar foe, the blaze of headlights on a coast road, the cicadas chattering like watches in our sodden hedges, yet never imagined the plague to come. So long had it crouched there in the dark, the cordon sanitaire, the stricken home, rats on the pavement, rats in the mind, St. James Infirmary, plain in the plague wind. Well, Mann, interestingly, not only saw the pertinence to future times like our own, and it's in an Irish context, but he broadly had this interesting comment about Yeats's cyclic theory and the famous gyres that puzzle so many students of a vision and of Yeats's cyclic history. And he said that those gyres, he said, are really a way of asking the question, where do we go from here? Is there a shape? He says they ask the questions, is there a shape to history? And where do we go from here? Well, I think that just 3 years after he wrote The Second Coming, Yeats wrote the wonderful poem, The Stairs Nest by My Window, which addresses that question, where do we go from here? And in my view, addresses it in a very clear-eyed way and in an optimistic way as to where, writing from the violence of the Civil War in 1922, Yeats saw some shape to history and gave a positive, optimistic answer to the question, where do we go from here? The poem begins by capturing something akin to the fear and anxiety we've all experienced while being closed in, locked in, both physically and emotionally, by both the pandemic and by the even worse virus of politically and racially motivated hatred. Yeats felt those same anxieties while closed in his tower, Torballilee, in the west of Ireland during the Irish Civil War. And as he later wrote, for the first, interestingly, his later writing were in some notes to the published version of his Nobel address. For the first week, there were no newspapers, no reliable news. We did not know who had won nor who had lost. And even after newspapers came, one never knew what was happening on the other side of the hill or of the line of trees. And then this interesting thought, again, thinking about history, seeing his own life in the context of history. Men must have lived so through many tumultuous centuries. Very interesting. And he captured that scene in all too recognizable terms, because in the poem he says, we are closed in and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Very interesting that nearly 100 years ago, Yeats's poem puts its finger on that uncertainty that we feel today about our future, both engendered by the fact that a pandemic could occur and by wondering what the effect of that pandemic will be on our lives and the lives of the world going forward. Very interesting that Yeats, although closed in and feeling the isolation in a very acute way, had a reaction which I think is instructive for us. He wrote in those notes I mentioned that he felt an overmastering desire not to grow unhappy or embittered, not to lose all sense of the beauty of nature. It's a shame, really, that we can't be in Sligo, or not most of us. It's a shame that I can't be in Sligo physically for the school this year and experience the great beauty of nature around Sligo, which I'm sure had its effect on Yeats as a very young man and stayed with him all those years, so that in the midst of being locked in, amidst uncertainty during the Civil War, he had one of his overriding thoughts, not to lose all sense of the beauty of nature. And the other thought, not to become embittered or grow unhappy. Interestingly, his friend Augusta Gregory was kind of in the room when it happened, when Yeats was writing that poem. And her journal shows us how Yeats sought the friendship of his neighbor as he labored to turn his troubled mind and psyche into poetry. Interestingly, her journal repeatedly observes that Yeats is working on what she calls his poem about Ballylee. And she says about that poem that he had begun to make it here, that is, at Cool, where he had stayed for a few days before taking up residence for the summer at nearby Torballylee. And one day in August, Gregory recorded a very revealing statement by Yeats about his creative process generally, and about the birth of that beautiful poem, The Stare's Nest by My Window. Here's her journal, very matter of fact. She doesn't signal that she's about to give us a very interesting aperçu on the writing of lyric poetry. Rain on the hay, she says. Yeats came over, still making his poem on Ballylee. He likes connecting it with the rising. Says lyric poetry is such a fragile thing. It ought to have its roots in history or some personal thing. Well, Yeats found some personal thing as the perfect metaphor to express the bomb for which his historical circumstances were crying out. And he explained the origin of the poem in those notes, in which he recounted that a stair, which he had explained is our West of Ireland name for a starling, had built a hole in my window. That would be the window on Torballylee. And then he said, presently, a strange thing happened. I began to smell honey in places where honey could not be, at the end of a stone passage or at some windy turn of the road. He wrote a poem, he said, out of the feeling of the moment. The key lines of the poem speak directly to our current predicament. Here they are. We had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. It's very interesting that we started out with friendship is all the house I have, and we're nearing the conclusion of this opening address with Yeats thinking about and imploring the bees, traditional symbols of sweetness and light, to come build in the empty house of the stair. Well, actually, 72 years after Yeats's Nobel lecture in 1923, Seamus Heaney used his own Nobel address to breathe new life into his predecessor's metaphor. Heaney's extensive discussion in his address of The Stare's Nest by My Window noted Yeats's ability to distill the emotions surrounding an experience and preserve them in memorable language. It was in this context that he said that he used the words that I relied on at the beginning of this address, and said that Yeats's work does what the necessary poetry always does, which is to touch the base of our sympathetic nature while taking in at the same time the unsympathetic reality of the world to which that nature is constantly exposed. Seamus, being the great, great teacher that he was, went on to comment on the form of Yeats's poem and how it solidifies its meaning. He instanced the way in which the trio of forces, build, house, and empty, is held in equilibrium by the triple rhyme of fantasies, enmities, and honeybees. These memorable lines embody their author's determination not to be unhappy or bitter or lose all sense of the beauty of nature, and instead summon metaphorical honeybees to build in the empty house of the stair. Yeats's poem lives on in so many ways, and one of them I want to mention, particularly because of another sad death last year of the wonderful poet and friend Evan Boland. And her 1967 poem, Yeats and Civil War, captures Yeats's achievement in a way that highlights its continuing pertinence, and again answers the question of why we're still doing this at the Yeats School. Her poem first addresses Yeats directly, situating him closed in by his tower, and then describing his miraculous escape by the creative imagination. Her poem says this: "Somehow you arranged your escape aboard a spirit ship, which every day hoisted sail out of fire and rape, and on that ship your mind was stowaway." Then, after recounting how the wind blew the smell of non-existent honey in Yeats's face, Boland's poem concludes, "Whatever we may learn, you are its sum, struggling to survive. A fantasy of honey, your reprieve." Auden might have had the stairs nest by my window in mind when addressing Yeats in his elegy. He said, and I'll quote from In Memory of W.B. Yeats, some of these resounding trochees. "Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the framing of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise." Very interesting that Stairs Nest by my window, Auden, I think, must have had it in mind with those interesting lines, "Let the healing fountain start. We have fed the heart on fantasies." Those lines of Yeats are so real today, and they echo so much in the poetry that has come in his wake, and of course in Seamus Heaney's beautiful Nobel address. And in fact, Seamus highlighted those Auden trochees in his elegy for Joseph Brodsky. Brodsky died on the 28th day of a month of January, just as Yeats did 57 years previously. They both share the what Seamus calls Death Day of January 28. And I think that coincidence, plus the fact that Auden had been of great help to Brodsky when Brodsky relocated to the United States after his exile. He was exiled from the Soviet Union. I think those facts are the reason why Seamus Heaney called his Brodsky elegy Audenesque. And he mentions those resounding trochees, the stressed, unstressed metric foot in a couple of lines that bring us back where we began, to the opening of our school. I'll quote part of Audenesque being addressed to Joseph Bradsky. Joseph, yes, you know the beat, Whiston Auden's metric feet. Trochee, falling thus, grief and meter order us. Repetition is the rule, spins on lines we learnt at school. So as we open our singing school for the 62nd time, I'd like to just, if I could, share with you over the airwaves this beautiful memory of Seamus. This is my little copy, I hope you can see it, of Audenesque. And on the day that Seamus presided over the planting of a tree in his memory, or his honor, now his memory, in the garden of the Irish Embassy here in Washington, Seamus inscribed my copy of this little book with the lines, spins on lines we learned at school. So here we are at school. I wish to everyone a productive, happy, fruitful, enjoyable, life-enhancing, life-sustaining school. And can I ask you, maybe could we, stealing a page out of Yeats, of all people, just pause a moment and dedicate a moment's memory to that laureled head. In this case, the laureled head not being Augusta Gregory, but being our dear friend and stalwart supporter of the Yeats Summer School, Seamus Heaney. Good luck to everyone in the school, and thank you.
Joe, you've set us on a good path for the rest of the school. We all appreciate and know that this is our first online school. And I suppose in a way it's striking that you came at the very beginning of the summer school, when it was all just coming together, coalescing, learning how to be a school, I suppose. And here it is, the longest running literary school in the world. So we're delighted that you were able to take part online. We know you'd far preferred to have been here with us in Sligo, and we would love to see you too. But fingers crossed that you'll be with us next year. And in the meantime, thank you so much for a deeply enriching and passionate talk tonight. I think Lauren Arrington and Charles Armstrong, who of course are the directors for this year's summer school, will be delighted to be set sail with that lovely talk. They will be with you on Friday night, well, Charles Armstrong will, at 6 o'clock for the first lecture, the first official lecture of the summer school. Thanks again to Dr. Hassett and all of you for joining us and him to hear his words.